In the glittering halls of a 1930s London auction house, a rare painting, The Midnight Rose, ignites a deadly game of greed and betrayal. When young Charles Haverford collapses, poisoned mid-bid, the room erupts in chaos. Enter Miss Jane Marple, an unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, unravelling a web of secrets among a nervous auctioneer, a desperate widow, a ruthless rival, and a mysterious art dealer. As motives unravel, obsession, debt, ambition. Miss Marple's quiet observations expose a chilling truth. One bidder's triumph was another's death sentence. Will she untangle the final thread before the killer strikes again? Chapter 1. The Gilded Hall, the auction house of Murchison & Sons, stood as a monument to opulence in the heart of London. Its facade, a stately Georgian edifice that whispered of wealth and tradition. Inside, the grand hall sparkled under the glow of 3 immense crystal chandeliers, their prisms casting fractured light across mahogany-panelled walls. Portraits of long-dead patrons, their eyes severe and unyielding, seemed to judge the assembled crowd. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood, expensive perfume, and the faint tang of anticipation. For tonight's auction promised a prize unlike any other. The Midnight Rose, a painting by the enigmatic Vincente Morelli, whose works were as rare as they were coveted. Miss Jane Marple sat near the back of the hall, her small bird-like figure almost lost in the sea of fur stoles and tailored suits. Her seat, chosen with care, afforded a clear view of the room without drawing attention. She adjusted her spectacles, her sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet curiosity of one who had spent a lifetime observing human nature. Her gloved hands rested on a modest black handbag, and a delicate lace shawl draped her shoulders, giving her the appearance of a harmless elderly spinster. But those who knew Miss Marple, few though they were, understood that her unassuming demeanour concealed a mind as keen as a razor. She had come at the request of her old friend, Lady Beatrice Harrow, whose anxious letter had arrived at St. Mary Mead only days before. "My nephew, Charles Haverford, is entangled in this dreadful auction," Beatrice had written, her elegant script betraying a tremor of unease. "He's reckless with money, Jane, and I fear he's in over his head. There's something queer about this painting, and I'd feel better knowing you were there to watch him." Miss Marple, who had a soft spot for Beatrice's maternal fretting, had packed her small suitcase and taken the train to London without hesitation. After all, she thought, a village like St. Mary Mead was not so different from a grand auction house. Both were stages for the quiet dramas of human greed, pride, and folly. The room buzzed with the low hum of conversation, as London's elite settled into their seats. Gentlemen in evening dress whispered to ladies in glittering gowns, their voices a symphony of speculation about the evening's star lot. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the front, where a velvet-draped easel awaited The Midnight Rose. The painting's legend preceded it, a tale of a Florentine noblewoman betrayed by her lover, whose anguish Morelli had captured in strokes of midnight blue and crimson. Its rarity, only 3 Morelli works were known to exist, had drawn collectors from across Europe, their wallets as deep as their ambitions. At the podium stood Mr. Reginald Murchison, the auctioneer, a wiry man in his 50s, with a moustache so sharp it might have been drawn with a ruler. His tales were immaculate, his manner polished to a fault, yet Miss Marple noted a faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sign, perhaps, of nerves beneath his practised charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonating like a well-tuned cello, "we are honoured to present an evening of unparalleled treasures. Our catalogue begins with Lot 1, a charming Gainsborough sketch. But I know your hearts are set on Lot 12, the Midnight Rose. Let us not delay." A ripple of excitement passed through the crowd, and Murchison's gavel struck with a satisfying crack. Miss Marple's attention turned to the key figures in this unfolding drama. To her left, Charles Haverford, Beatrice's nephew, sat with an air of restless energy. He was a handsome man in his early 30s. His dark hair slicked back, his jaw set with determination. His fingers drummed on the arm of his chair, and his eyes, bright with a feverish intensity, never left the empty easel. Miss Marple wondered what drove him, love of art or something less noble. Across the aisle sat Mrs. Evelyn Crane, the painting seller, a widow whose black silk gown seemed to absorb the light around her. Her face, pale and drawn, held a fragile beauty, but her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed a quiet agitation. Was it grief, Miss Marple pondered, or the weight of parting with such a treasure? Further along, Mr. Lawrence Tate, a rival bidder, lounged with the confidence of a man accustomed to winning. His sharp features and cold grey eyes gave him the look of a hawk sizing up its prey. He glanced at Charles with a faint smirk, as if already savouring victory. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen men like Tate before, in village squabbles over land or legacy, their ambition cloaked in charm, but no less ruthless. Finally, her gaze settled on a stranger. Miss Clara Duval, a young woman in a sapphire gown, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She sat alone, her posture poised, yet detached, sipping champagne with a smile that seemed to hold a secret. When her eyes met Mrs. Crane's for a fleeting moment, a shadow passed between them, unnoticed by all but Miss Marple. The first lots passed in a blur of bids and murmurs, each gavel strike punctuating the rising tension. Charles bid on a minor watercolour, his paddle rising with a flourish that drew whispers from nearby seats. Mrs. Crane's eyes followed him, her expression unreadable. Tate leaned back, his arms crossed, biding his time. Miss Duval scribbled in a small notebook, her pen moving with the precision of one cataloguing more than prices. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. Something was brewing in this gilded hall, something far darker than the gleam of chandeliers. She had seen it before, the spark of envy, the glint of desperation, and she knew it rarely ended well. As the auctioneer called Lot 5 a porcelain vase, Miss Marple leaned back, her mind already sifting through the threads of motive and opportunity. People are so predictable, she thought, her eyes flickering over the crowd, and yet so very surprising. The stage was set, and she would watch it unfold, as she always did, with the patience of one who knew the truth would reveal itself in time. Chapter 2. The fatal bid. The grand hall of Murchison and Sons thrummed with a restless energy as the auction progressed, each lot stoking the fever of the assembled bidders. The chandelier above cast their radiant glow, but to Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly in her unobtrusive corner, the light seemed to reveal more than it concealed. Her sharp eyes, framed by delicate spectacles, darted from face to face, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the fleeting glances, the tightening of lips. The room was a stage, and its players, she sensed, were poised for a drama far greater than the sale of mere objects. Mr. Reginald Murchison, the auctioneer, stood at his podium like a conductor before an orchestra, his voice weaving a spell over the crowd. His moustache quivered faintly as he announced Lot 8, a pair of ormolu candelabra from a French chateau, with a flourish that betrayed his relish for the role. "A steal at £10,000, he declared, his eyes sweeping the room for EOS system, for eager bidders. "Shall we start at £5,000? The paddles rose swiftly, and Miss Marple watched with interest, her knitting needles idle in her lap for the moment. She was not here for candelabra, but for the undercurrents of human nature swirling beneath the polished surface of the auction. Charles Haverford, Lady Beatrice's nephew, sat 3 rows ahead, his broad shoulders tense with anticipation. His paddle shot up for the candelabra, though his bid was quickly overtaken by a portly gentleman in a velvet waistcoat. Charles's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck. He was a man driven by passion, she thought, but whether for art or pride, she could not yet tell. His fervour had drawn her attention from the moment she arrived, prompted by Beatrice's worried letter. "He's obsessed with that painting," Beatrice had written, "and I fear it will ruin him." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Charles, whose fingers gripped his paddle like a lifeline. Across the aisle, Mrs. Evelyn Crane, the seller of the Midnight Rose, sat with the stillness of a statue, her black silk gown absorbing the chandelier light. Her pale face, framed by a widow's veil, was a mask of composure, yet her hands twisted a lace handkerchief in her lap, betraying a quiet turmoil. Miss Marple wondered about her story, the loss of her husband, the decision to part with a painting so steeped in personal history. Was it grief or necessity that drove her to this auction? The question hung in Miss Marple's mind, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Mr. Lawrence Tate, the rival bidder, lounged with an air of calculated ease, his sharp features softened by a practised smile. His grey eyes, however, were cold and unyielding, fixed on Charles with the intensity of a predator. Miss Marple had seen such men in her village, men who viewed life as a game to be won, no matter the cost. Tate's paddle remained still, but his presence was a silent challenge, a shadow cast over Charles's eager bids. She recalled Beatrice's mention of Tate's reputation as a ruthless collector, one who had once outbid a duke for a Renaissance bronze by sheer force of will. The Midnight Rose was his prize tonight, and Miss Marple sensed he would not yield easily. Miss Clara Duval, the mysterious guest, sat apart from the others, her sapphire gown catching the light like a jewel. Her auburn hair gleamed under the chandeliers, and her delicate fingers toyed with a champagne flute, her lips curved in a faint enigmatic smile. She had introduced herself to Miss Marple earlier as a French art dealer, her accent smooth and her manner polished, yet there was something elusive about her. She seemed to watch the room with a detached curiosity, as if she were a spectator at a play rather than a participant. When her eyes met Mrs. Crane's for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition passed between them, unnoticed by all but Miss Marple's keen gaze. The auction rolled on, each lot drawing gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Lot 9, a silver tea service, sparked a flurry of bids, and Charles's paddle rose again, his voice sharp as he called out £15,000. Miss Marple noted the reckless edge to his bidding, as if he were staking more than money. Tate watched him with a faint smirk, his own paddle still, biding his time. Mrs. Crane's eyes followed Charles, her expression unreadable but taut. like a string stretched to breaking. Miss Duval scribbled in her notebook, her pen moving swiftly, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets those pages held. As Lot 11, a set of rare Venetian glassware, was announced, the room's anticipation reached a fever pitch. Everyone knew what followed. The midnight rose, the evening's crown jewel. Murchison's voice grew richer, his gestures more theatrical, as he described the glassware with a reverence that bordered on reverence. "Exquisite craftsmanship, ladies and gentlemen, a testament to the artistry of Murano." The bids flew fast, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere, her mind weaving connections between the players. Charles's obsession, Mrs. Crane's tension, Tate's predatory calm, Miss Duval's cryptic presence, each was a piece of a puzzle she had yet to solve. At last, Murchison announced Lot 12. The room fell silent, the air heavy with expectation. A velvet curtain was drawn back, revealing the midnight rose on its easel. The painting was a marvel. A woman in a midnight blue gown stood beneath a moonlit sky, her face a haunting blend of sorrow and defiance, her crimson shawl a splash of blood against the darkness. The crowd murmured in awe, and even Miss Marple, who cared little for art, felt a shiver of its power. The story of the painting, a noble woman betrayed, her lover's treachery immortalized in Morelli's brushstrokes, seemed to pulse in the air. Murchison's gavel hovered. "We begin at £30,000, he called. Charles's paddle shot up instantly. £50,000. His voice was firm, but Miss Marple detected a tremor of desperation. Tate countered smoothly, £60,000, his tone cool and deliberate. The room buzzed as the bids climbed. £75,000, £90,000, £100,000. Each call tightening the tension like a noose. Charles's face grew flushed, his eyes burning with a fervour that alarmed Miss Marple. Tate's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tightened on his paddle, betraying a hunger beneath his calm. At £120,000, Charles raised his paddle again, his voice hoarse. £130,000. The crowd gasped, and Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening. Something was wrong. Charles's hand trembled as he set his paddle down, his other hand reaching for his champagne flute. He took a sip, then another, his movements jerky. Suddenly, his face contorted, his eyes widening in shock. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The flute slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished floor with a sound like a gunshot. Charles staggered, his chair scraping back, and collapsed in a heap, his body convulsing briefly before going still. The room erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, and Murchison froze at his podium, his gavel clattering to the floor. Mrs. Crane rose, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Tate sat motionless, his face a mask of indifference, though Miss Marple noted the slight clench of his jaw. Miss Duval, who had been sipping her champagne moments before, was nowhere to be seen, her seat empty. Miss Marple's mind raced, her calm exterior belying the storm of thoughts within. Poison, she thought instantly, her village instincts recognizing the signs, the sudden collapse, the flushed face, the bitter scent of almonds in the air, faint but unmistakable. A doctor, a distinguished man with a grey beard seated near the front, rushed to Charles's side, his fingers probing for a pulse. The crowd pressed forward, their voices a cacophony of shock and speculation. "He's dead," the doctor announced gravely, his words cutting through the din. "I suspect poison, cyanide, perhaps, in the champagne. The word poison sent a ripple of dread through the room, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had seen death before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, but never so brazen, so public. Murchison, recovering his composure, called for order, his voice strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. The authorities will be notified." The staff moved swiftly, ushering the crowd back, but Miss Marple remained in her seat, her mind already at work. She observed the reactions around her. Murchison's pallor, his hands shaking as he retrieved his gavel, Mrs. Crane's trembling form, her veil now askew, Tate's unnerving calm, his eyes fixed on the painting as if nothing had happened, and the empty chair where Miss Duval had sat, her absence a silent question mark. A young waiter, pale and wide-eyed, hovered near the fallen glass, his tray trembling. Miss Marple noted his nervousness, wondering if he had served the fatal drink. The champagne flutes, identical in their elegance, were scattered across tables, their contents now suspect. She recalled Charles's final sip, the way his hand had shaken, not from nerves, she now realized, but from the poison's swift grip. Cyanide, the doctor had said, and Miss Marple knew it acted quickly, leaving little time for doubt or rescue. The police arrived within minutes, their heavy footsteps echoing in the hall. Inspector Harraway, a burly man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense air, took charge, his officers fanning out to secure the scene. He barked orders to preserve the evidence, the glass, the bottle, the body, while questioning Murchison, who stood rigid with indignation. "This is an outrage," the auctioneer protested. "My establishment is above reproach." But his twitching moustache betrayed his unease, and Miss Marple wondered what secrets lay behind his polished facade. The inspector moved on to Mrs. Crane, who sat weeping softly, her handkerchief now a sodden rag. "I barely knew him," she murmured, her voice fragile. "He was just a bidder, nothing more." Yet Miss Marple sensed a deeper connection, a thread she could not yet grasp. Tate, when questioned, shrugged with casual disdain. "Haverford was a fool, throwing money he didn't have. I had nothing to do with this." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of his eyes toward the painting, a hunger that belied his indifference. Miss Duval was found in the lobby, her sapphire gown a stark contrast to the sombre mood. "I felt faint," she explained to the inspector, her voice soft but steady. The excitement was too much. Her eyes, however, avoided his, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands, hidden by the folds of her dress. The old lady's mind turned to the notebook Miss Duval had been writing in. Perhaps a clue lay there, waiting to be uncovered. As the police cordoned off the hall, Miss Marple remained in her seat, her knitting resumed, the soft click of needles a counterpoint to the chaos. The inspector's focus was on the physical, the glass, the bottle, the fingerprints, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She knew that murder was rarely a matter of mere mechanics. It was a tapestry of motives woven from greed, envy, or fear. Charles's obsession with the midnight rose had made him a target, but who had wielded the poison? Murchison, with his nervous tics? Mrs. Crane, driven by some hidden desperation? Tate, whose cold ambition seemed boundless? Or Miss Duval, whose sudden departure was too convenient to ignore? She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, a farmer poisoned over a disputed field, his death masked as an accident. The village had buzzed with gossip, but Miss Marple had seen the truth in the small things. A glance, a hesitation, a lie too carefully told. Here, in this gilded hall, the stakes were higher, the players more sophisticated, but human nature remained the same. People are so careless with their secrets, she thought, her eyes scanning the room. The painting, The Midnight Rose, stood untouched on its easel, its tragic beauty a silent witness to the crime. As the police escorted the crowd to a waiting area, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She paused by Charles's body, now covered with a cloth, and murmured a quiet prayer. Inspector Harroway glanced at her, dismissing her as a harmless old woman, but Miss Marple was accustomed to being underestimated. It was, after all, her greatest advantage. She slipped out of the hall, her mind already piecing together the fragments of this deadly puzzle, determined to unravel the truth before another life was lost. Chapter 3. The Inspector Arrives. The grand hall of Murchison & Sons, so recently alive with the fervour of bidding, now bore the sombre weight of tragedy. The chandeliers still gleamed, but their light seemed dimmed, as if reluctant to illuminate the scene of Charles Haverford's sudden death. The crowd, once a glittering assembly of London's elite, huddled in clusters, their whispers sharp with shock and speculation. Miss Jane Marple remained in her corner, her small figure unobtrusive amid the chaos, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the unfolding drama with her customary calm. To her, the room was not merely a crime scene, but a stage where human frailties played out, each gesture and glance a clue to the truth. Inspector Harroway's arrival brought a shift in the air, his heavy tread and brusque manner cutting through the murmurs like a scythe. He was a man of middle age, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a face that suggested he had seen too many of humanity's darker deeds to be surprised by this one. His grey eyes, sharp and unyielding, scanned the room as he conferred with his constables, who moved with practised efficiency to secure the area. The shattered champagne flute, its contents now a deadly question, was carefully collected, and the bottle from which it had been poured was sealed in an evidence bag. The inspector's voice, gruff but authoritative, rose above the din. "Nobody leaves until I've spoken with them. This is a murder investigation." Miss Marple, overlooked as a mere elderly spectator, watched the inspector's methodical approach with interest. He was a man of facts, she thought, one who trusted in fingerprints and timelines, but she knew that murder often hid in the shadows of motive and opportunity, places where her own quiet observations thrived. She noted the way his gaze lingered on the key figures: Mr. Reginald Murchison, the auctioneer, whose polished demeanour had cracked under the strain; Mrs. Evelyn Crane, the seller, whose tear-streaked face betrayed more than simple shock; Mr. Lawrence Tate, the rival bidder, whose cool detachment seemed almost theatrical; and the empty chair where Miss Clara Duval had sat before her swift exit. Harroway began with Murchison, who stood by the podium, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "This is an outrage, Inspector," he protested, his voice high with indignation. "My auction house has never seen such a scandal. The champagne was served to all, standard practice, I assure you." His moustache twitched, and Miss Marple noted the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, a contrast to his usual composure. Harroway's eyes narrowed. "Standard or not, someone poisoned that glass. Who had access to it?" Murchison stammered, insisting the waiters handled all service. But his glance toward the staff betrayed a flicker of unease. Miss Marple filed this away. wondering if Murchison's agitation stemmed from fear of scandal or something deeper. Mrs. Crane was next, her black silk gown rustling as she rose to meet the inspector. Her veil, now lifted, revealed eyes red with tears, though Miss Marple sensed a controlled grief, as if the widow were playing a part. "I barely knew Mr. Haverford," she said, her voice soft but steady. "He was just a bidder, one of many." Harroway pressed her, asking about the painting's history, but Mrs. Crane's answers were vague. "It belonged to my late husband, a cherished piece. I sold it to settle his affairs." Her hands twisted the handkerchief, and Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor, a sign of nerves that belied her calm words. Did she know more about Charles's obsession with the midnight rose than she admitted? Mr. Tate, summoned to a corner of the hall, faced the inspector with an air of bored indifference. "Haverford was a reckless fool," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "He bid beyond his means, but I had no reason to kill him. I'd have won the painting fair and square." His grey eyes met Harroway's without flinching, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign of tension. She recalled his earlier lie about not drinking during auctions, a small inconsistency, but one that gnawed at her. Tate's ambition was palpable, and she wondered if his desire for the midnight rose extended beyond mere possession to a need to crush his rival. Miss Duval, tracked down in the lobby by a constable, returned with an air of reluctant compliance. Her sapphire gown shimmered as she moved, and her auburn hair caught the light, drawing eyes despite the grim circumstances. "I felt ill," she explained, her French accent lending her words a musical lilt. "The excitement of the auction, you understand. It overwhelmed me." Harroway's questions were blunt. Had she seen anything suspicious? Had she spoken to Charles? Her answers were polite but evasive, her eyes avoiding his as she claimed no knowledge of the poison. Miss Marple, watching from her seat, noted the way Miss Duval's fingers brushed the edge of her small notebook, tucked into her purse. Was it merely a record of bids, or something more? As the inspector moved through the crowd, questioning waiters and guests, Miss Marple's mind turned to the mechanics of the crime. The cyanide, as the doctor had suggested, was swift and merciless, requiring precise delivery. The champagne flute, identical to dozens others, suggested a targeted act. Someone had known which glass would reach Charles. She recalled the young waiter Tom, who had hovered near Charles's table, his face pale with nerves. Had he been an unwitting pawn, or something more? The bottle, too, was a puzzle. Murchison claimed it was shared among the guests, yet only Charles had fallen. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village scandal years ago, where a poisoned bottle of sherry had unmasked a jealous suitor. The method was different, but the intent was the same: a calculated strike against a rival. The inspector's focus on physical evidence, glass fragments, fingerprints, the bottle's seal, was thorough, but Miss Marple knew the truth often lay in the intangible. She observed the crowd's reactions, the society matrons clutching their pearls, the businessmen whispering theories of sabotage, the waiters exchanging nervous glances. Murchison, now pacing near the podium, seemed on the verge of collapse, his reputation teetering. Mrs. Crane, seated again, stared at the covered form of Charles's body, her expression a mix of sorrow and something else, guilt perhaps, or fear. Tate leaned against a wall, his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with a detachment that bordered on arrogance. Miss Duval, meanwhile, had resumed her seat, her notebook now closed, her face a mask of composure. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved rhythmically, a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. She considered Charles's final moments, the flushed face, the trembling hand, the sudden collapse. His obsession with the midnight rose had been his undoing, but why? Had he known something about the painting that made him a threat? Or was his death merely the result of a rival's greed? She thought of Tate's cold ambition, Mrs. Crane's hidden distress, Murchison's nervous tics, and Miss Duval's cryptic departure. Each had opportunity, but motive was the key, and that remained elusive. A constable approached Miss Marple, his notebook open. "Your name, ma'am, and what did you see?" he asked, his tone brisk. She smiled faintly, her voice soft and unassuming. "Jane Marple, and I'm afraid I saw very little, young man. Just an old lady enjoying the auction." The constable nodded, dismissing her as irrelevant, and moved on. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Being underestimated was her greatest asset. She had seen more than the constable could imagine. The flicker of Tate's eyes, the tremor in Mrs. Crane's hands, the haste of Miss Duval's exit. These were the threads of the tapestry, and she would weave them together in time. As the police continued their work, the hall grew quieter, the crowd subdued by the weight of the tragedy. Inspector Harroway conferred with his men, his face grim. "We'll need statements from everyone," he announced, "and nobody touches that painting until we're through." The midnight rose stood on its easel, its tragic beauty untouched by the chaos, a silent witness to the crime. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, wondering what secrets it held. Was it merely a prize, or the key to Charles's murder? She recalled a conversation with Beatrice, who had spoken of Charles's fascination with Morelli's work. "He said it was his legacy," Beatrice had confided, her voice heavy with worry. Miss Marple wondered if that legacy was tied to the painting's history. A tale of betrayal that mirrored the events of this night. She made a mental note to learn more about the Midnight Rose, its origins, and the man who had painted it. For now, she would watch and listen, as she always did, trusting that the truth would reveal itself in the small, overlooked details. As the crowd was ushered to a waiting area, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and rose, her movements slow but purposeful. She cast one last glance at the hall, where Charles's body lay beneath its cloth, a stark reminder of human frailty. "People are so careless with their desires," she thought, her mind already turning to the next steps. The inspector might have his evidence, but Miss Marple had her instincts, honed by years of village intrigues. She would follow the threads wherever they led and uncover the heart of this deadly auction. Chapter 4. The Widow's Tale. The morning after the tragic auction, London lay under a veil of mist, its streets hushed as if in deference to the previous night's grim events. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the chill, made her way to Belgravia, where Mrs. Evelyn Crane resided in a townhouse of understated elegance. The house, with its ivy-clad facade and tall windows, spoke of old money, though Miss Marple's keen eye noted the faint signs of neglect, a chipped doorstep, a curtain slightly askew. She had come under the guise of offering condolences, but her true purpose was to unravel the threads of Mrs. Crane's connection to Charles Haverford's death. In her experience, grief often cloaked secrets, and Miss Marple was adept at peering beneath such veils. Mrs. Crane received her in a drawing-room adorned with faded grandeur. The walls bore traces of gilt-framed portraits, though several spots were bare, suggesting recent sales. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the widow's pale face. She wore black crepe, her widow's weeds a stark contrast to her delicate features, and her dark hair was drawn back severely, accentuating the hollows beneath her eyes. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but steady. "It's kind of you to call. I'm afraid I'm not myself after last night." Miss Marple settled into a plush armchair, her small figure almost swallowed by its cushions. She adjusted her spectacles and offered a sympathetic smile. "My dear, such a dreadful shock. I thought you might appreciate a quiet word, away from the clamour of the police." Her tone was gentle, her words chosen to soothe, but her eyes missed nothing. The way Mrs. Crane's fingers tightened on her teacup, the faint tremor in her posture. Tea was served by a nervous maid, who spilled a drop on the saucer and flushed scarlet before retreating. Mrs. Crane poured with practised grace, though her hands shook slightly. "I scarcely knew Mr. Haverford," she began unprompted, as if eager to establish her distance. "He was a bidder, nothing more. His death is tragic, but I can't imagine why anyone would do such a thing." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then darted away, settling on the fire. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting its faint bitterness. Oversteeped, perhaps, or a reflection of the widow's state of mind. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice mild, "how a painting can stir such passions. The midnight rose must hold great meaning for you, parting with it as you have." She paused, watching Mrs. Crane's reaction. The widow's lips parted, then closed as if weighing her response. "It was my husband's," Mrs. Crane said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Edward bought it in Florence, years ago. During happier times he said it spoke to him, of love and loss. After his death, I couldn't bear to look at it. The memories were too painful." Her fingers twisted the lace of her sleeve, and Miss Marple noted the genuine sorrow in her eyes, though it was tinged with something else. Guilt, perhaps, or fear. "How difficult it must have been," Miss Marple murmured, her tone all sympathy. "And yet, to sell such a treasure suggests great necessity. Times are hard for many, I'm told." Her words were a gentle probe, designed to draw out the truth without alarming her hostess. Mrs. Crane's face tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might deflect. But the widow sighed, her shoulders sagging. "You're perceptive, Miss Marple," she said, a wry smile touching her lips. "Yes, I've had financial troubles since Edward's passing. The estate was not as robust as I'd hoped, and there are debts to settle. The auction was meant to be my salvation." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her eyes glistening. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was racing. Financial desperation was a powerful motive, but did it extend to murder? She steered the conversation to Charles. "Mr. Haverford seemed quite determined to have the painting," she remarked, as if musing aloud. "Did you ever speak with him about it?" Mrs. Crane hesitated, her teacup clattering softly against its saucer. "He came to see me about a month ago," she admitted. "He was intense. Said the painting was his legacy, that it belonged with him. I thought he was merely enthusiastic, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head, as if dispelling a troubling thought. Miss Marple's knitting, which she had produced from her handbag, lay idle in her lap. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. His legacy. How curious. Did he say why? Mrs. Crane's eyes flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flash of panic. No, not precisely, the widow replied too quickly. He spoke of Morelli's genius, of the painting's history. I didn't press him. I was more concerned with the sale. Her words were plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in her composure, a hint that Charles's visit had left a deeper impression. The conversation turned to lighter matters. Mrs. Crane's garden, the weather. But Miss Marple's mind remained on that crack. She recalled a village widow, Mrs. Elwood, who had sold her late husband's prized books to cover debts, only to be entangled in a scandal when one buyer turned up dead. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded Miss Marple that desperation could drive even the gentlest souls to dark deeds. Had Mrs. Crane, pressed by financial ruin, seen Charles as a threat to her plans? Or was there another secret tied to the midnight rose? As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by a small table where a photograph of Edward Crane stood in a silver frame. He was a handsome man with a scholarly air, his eyes fixed on some distant point. A fine likeness, Miss Marple said, her tone admiring. Mrs. Crane's face softened. He was a dreamer, she said. The painting was his dream, but dreams don't pay bills. Her voice held a bitter edge, and Miss Marple filed it away. Another thread in the tapestry. Stepping into the misty street, Miss Marple pulled her shawl closer, her mind sifting through the morning's revelations. Mrs. Crane's financial straits were clear, but her connection to Charles's death was murky. Widow's tears seemed genuine, yet her hesitation about Charles's visit suggested she knew more than she had shared. Miss Marple thought of the painting, its tragic beauty a magnet for obsession. Had Charles's claim to it, his talk of legacy, threatened Mrs. Crane's hopes of salvation? Or was she merely a grieving woman caught in a web not of her making? As she hailed a cab to return to her hotel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other players. Mr. Tate's cold ambition, Miss Duval's cryptic departure, Murchison's nervous tics, each held a piece of the puzzle. She recalled a St. Mary Mead gossip, where a woman's tears had masked a cunning plot to rid herself of a rival. Mrs. Crane was no village schemer, but human nature, Miss Marple knew, was the same in Belgravia as in a country lane. She would need to dig deeper, to follow the threads of motive and opportunity, to uncover the truth behind Charles's fatal bid. Back at her hotel, Miss Marple settled into a chair by the window, her knitting resumed. The mist outside mirrored the haze of the case, but she was patient. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things, the tremor of a hand, the pause in a voice, the shadow of a secret. She would visit Mr. Tate next, to test his polished arrogance against her quiet probing. For now, she sipped her tea, her eyes on the grey London sky, and let the pieces of the puzzle settle in her mind, waiting for the pattern to emerge. Chapter 5. The Rival's Ambition. The afternoon sun struggled through the London mist, casting a pallid glow over the city, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to a discreet café in Mayfair. The establishment, with its frosted glass windows and velvet-curtained alcoves, was a favourite haunt of the art world's elite, where deals were struck over espresso and secrets whispered behind menus. Miss Marple had arranged to meet Mr. Lawrence Tate here, having sent a note that morning requesting a conversation. She had worded it carefully, appealing to his curiosity about the old lady who notices things, a phrase she knew would pique his ego. Men like Tate, she had learned in her St. Mary Mead days, could rarely resist the chance to assert their superiority. She arrived early, settling into a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. Her grey shawl draped over her shoulders, and her knitting lay in her lap, a prop that made her appear harmless, even quaint. But her blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. The waiter's hurried polish of a spoon, the couple in the next alcove arguing in hushed tones, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering from a previous patron. Miss Marple had chosen this setting for its intimacy. A man like Tate, she reasoned, might reveal more in a quiet corner than under the glare of an auction house or police station. Mr. Tate arrived precisely on time, his tailored overcoat and polished shoes announcing his presence before he spoke. He was a tall man, lean and sharp-featured, with grey eyes that seemed to dissect everything they touched. His smile, when he offered it, was a calculated gesture, more weapon than warmth. "Miss Marple," he said, sliding into the chair opposite her, "I confess I'm intrigued. What could an elderly lady want with me after last night's unpleasantness?" His tone was smooth, but there was a challenge in it, as if he were testing her. Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle bemusement. "Oh, Mr. Tate, I'm merely an old woman with a fondness for conversation. Tragedies like poor Mr. Haverford set one to thinking, don't they? I thought you might have some insight, being such a keen collector." Her words were light, but her eyes held his, steady and unyielding. She had dealt with men like Tate before, village squires or shopkeepers with grand ambitions, their charm a mask for ruthlessness. Tate, she suspected, was cut from the same cloth, only with a finer thread. He leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Haverford was a fool," he said bluntly, his voice low but clear. "Throw in money at the Midnight Rose as if he could afford it. I wanted the painting, yes, but I'd have won it without resorting to poison." His lips curled into a faint smirk, and Miss Marple noted the confidence in his posture, the way he seemed to relish the game. But there was a hardness in his eyes, a glint that reminded her of a fox circling a henhouse. "You're very sure of your victory," she remarked, her voice mild as she sipped her tea. "It must take great discipline to bid so calmly in such a heated auction." She paused, letting the silence stretch, a technique she had perfected in countless village parlours. Tate's smirk faltered just for a moment, and she saw it, the flicker of unease beneath his bravado. "Discipline is everything," he said, recovering quickly. "I don't drink during auctions, keeps the mind sharp. Haverford, on the other hand, was half drunk on champagne and hubris." His words were sharp, but Miss Marple's memory stirred. She had seen Tate with a glass in hand during the auction, a detail he now conveniently omitted. She made a mental note of the lie, small but significant, like a dropped stitch in a sweater. "Did you know Mr. Haverford well?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a vicar's wife at a church fete. Tate's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, as if sizing her up. "Well enough to know he was out of his depth," he replied. "He'd been chasing Morelli's work for years, always talking about his legacy." "Nonsense, of course. He was a dilettante, not a collector." The scorn in his voice was palpable, and Miss Marple wondered if it masked a deeper resentment. She nodded, as if agreeing, her knitting needles clicking softly. "A legacy can be a powerful thing," she mused. "I once knew a man in my village who sold his land to buy a single book, all because he believed it tied him to his ancestors. Such obsessions can blind us, don't you think?" Her words were a gentle probe, and she watched Tate's reaction closely. His fingers stilled on the table, and for a moment his guard slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. Haverford's obsession was his downfall, he said, his voice colder now. He thought the Midnight Rose would make him a legend in the art world. I, on the other hand, collect for the thrill of possession, not some romantic notion. He leaned back, his smile returning, but Miss Marple sensed the effort behind it. Tate was a man who thrived on control, and Charles's reckless bidding had threatened that control. Was it enough to drive him to murder? She shifted the conversation, her voice as soft as ever. "The auction must have been quite a spectacle for you, watching your rival so closely. Did you notice anything unusual before his collapse?" Tate's eyes flickered, and she saw him weigh his response. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said at last. "Haverford was flushed, excitable, but that was his nature. I was focused on the painting, not him." His words were smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, a tell she had seen in village liars who thought themselves clever. They spoke for a few minutes more, Tate growing increasingly restless under her gentle probing. He spoke of his collection, a Degas sketch, a Turner watercolour, with a pride that bordered on arrogance, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead grocer, Mr. Tuttle, who had sabotaged a rival's shipment to secure a contract, his calm denials undone by a single careless glance. Tate's lie about the champagne was such a glance, a crack in his polished facade. Had he slipped cyanide into Charles's glass, counting on the chaos of the auction to cover his tracks? As Tate rose to leave, his parting words were clipped. "You're an interesting woman, Miss Marple, but I doubt you'll find anything the police haven't. This was a tragedy, nothing more." He tipped his hat and strode out, his coat swirling behind him. Miss Marple watched him go, her knitting needles pausing. "Tragedy indeed," she murmured, "but tragedies have authors." She lingered at the cafe, her tea grown cold, her mind sifting through the encounter. Tate's ambition was a fire that burned cold, his desire for the Midnight Rose not just about art, but about triumph. His lie about the champagne suggested he had something to hide, and his scorn for Charles hinted at a rivalry deeper than mere bidding. She thought of the waiter Tom, who had hovered near Charles's table, and wondered if Tate had used him as a tool, much as Mr. Tuttle had once bribed a delivery boy to spoil his rival's goods. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the painting itself, its haunting beauty a magnet for obsession. Tate had spoken of possession, but was it the painting he craved, or the defeat of his rival? She recalled Charles's flushed face, his trembling hand as he sipped the fatal champagne. The cyanide had been precise, a calculated act, and Tate's cool demeanour made him a likely candidate. Yet she could not dismiss Mrs. Crane's financial desperation or Miss Duval's cryptic behaviour. Each was a thread in the tapestry, and Miss Marple knew the truth lay in their weaving. She gathered her knitting and paid the bill, her movements slow but purposeful. The mist had thickened outside, cloaking the city in secrecy, but Miss Marple was undaunted. She would seek out Miss Duval next, to test her enigmatic smile against the old lady's quiet persistence. For now, she stepped into the street, her mind alive with possibilities, trusting that the small things, a lie, a glance, a tremor, would lead her to the heart of this deadly auction. Chapter 6. the enigmatic guest. The mist that clung to London streets had begun to lift by late afternoon, revealing a city that seemed to hold its breath after the tragedy at Murchison and Sons. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the lingering chill, made her way to a modest hotel in Bloomsbury, where Miss Clara Duval was staying. The hotel, a narrow building with a faded sign, lacked the grandeur of Belgravia or Mayfair, but its quiet discretion suited a woman who seemed to prefer shadows to spotlight. Miss Marple had sent a note ahead, couched in polite terms, requesting a meeting to discuss the art world's finer points. She knew such flattery would appeal to Miss Duval's cultivated air, and she was not mistaken. A reply had come promptly, inviting her for tea. The hotel's lounge was a study in faded elegance, its chintz curtains and worn armchairs evoking a bygone era. Miss Marple settled at a small table near a window, her grey shawl neatly folded over her arm, her knitting bag at her side. She adjusted her spectacles, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a bird watching for danger. A few other guests, a tired-looking businessman, a couple whispering over guidebooks, paid her no mind, and she preferred it that way. Being underestimated, she had long ago learned, was a powerful advantage. Miss Duval entered with the grace of a dancer. Her sapphire gown replaced by a tailored green dress that accentuated her auburn hair. Her smile was warm but guarded, and her eyes, a striking hazel, held a flicker of curiosity as they met Miss Marple's. "Miss Marple," she said, her French accent lending a musical quality to her words, "I am delighted to meet you. Your note was most intriguing." She sat opposite, her movements precise, and ordered tea with a wave of her hand. The waiter, a young man with a nervous air, scurried off, and Miss Marple noted his resemblance to Tom, the waiter from the auction house. A coincidence, perhaps, but she filed it away. "I'm just an old woman with a fondness for art," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and unassuming. "Your knowledge of Morelli's work caught my attention last night. Such a tragedy, to have it overshadowed by poor Mr. Haverford's death." Her words were gentle, but her eyes were keen, watching for any crack in Miss Duval's poised exterior. The younger woman's smile tightened, just for a moment, and Miss Marple sensed a wariness beneath her charm. "Yes, a terrible thing," Miss Duval replied, her tone measured. "I came to observe the auction, not to witness such horror. The Midnight Rose is a masterpiece, but now it will be forever tainted." Her fingers brushed the edge of her purse, where Miss Marple knew the small notebook lay. The gesture was fleeting, but it reminded her of a village girl who had clutched a love letter while denying her sweetheart's existence. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, often hid in such small movements. The tea arrived, served in chipped porcelain that spoke of the hotel's better days. Miss Marple poured, her hands steady despite her age, and offered a scone with a smile. "You must know so much about Morelli," she said, as if making idle conversation. "His paintings are so rare, and the Midnight Rose has such a story. Betrayal, wasn't it? I wonder if that drew Mr. Haverford to it." She watched Miss Duval closely, noting the slight stiffening of her posture. "Morelli's work is steeped in emotion," Miss Duval said, her voice smooth but deliberate. "The story of the noblewoman, betrayed by her lover, resonates with many. I suspect Mr. Haverford saw himself in that narrative, romantic perhaps, but misguided." Her words were carefully chosen, and Miss Marple detected a hint of disdain, as if she found Charles's passion beneath her. Yet there was something else, a flicker of unease when Charles's name was mentioned, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. "Did you ever meet him?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a vicar's wife inquiring about parish gossip. Miss Duval's eyes flickered to her teacup, and she took a slow sip before answering. "No, not directly," she said. "I saw him at the auction, of course, bidding so fiercely. He was noticeable." Her hesitation was slight, but Miss Marple caught it, like a dropped stitch in a pattern. She recalled Miss Duval's swift departure from the auction hall, moments after Charles's collapse, and wondered what had driven her to leave so abruptly. "Your notebook intrigued me," Miss Marple said, her voice light as she buttered a scone. "You were writing so diligently during the auction. Are you a collector yourself, or perhaps a scholar?" The question was a gentle probe, designed to test Miss Duval's composure. The younger woman's smile faltered, and her fingers tightened on her purse, a gesture so brief it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. "I'm an art dealer," Miss Duval replied, recovering her poise. "I keep notes on pieces that interest me. Provenance, condition, that sort of thing. The Midnight Rose is a rare find, and I wanted to record its moment." Her explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a half-truth. The notebook, she suspected, held more than auction details, and Miss Duval's guarded manner suggested she was protecting something, or someone. The conversation turned to Morelli's work, and Miss Duval's knowledge was impressive, her passion for the artist evident in her animated descriptions of his brushwork and symbolism. Yet when Miss Marple mentioned a rumour of Morelli's lost sketches, something she had overheard in passing at the auction, Miss Duval's expression changed. Her eyes widened briefly, and she set her teacup down with a faint clatter. "Sketches?" she said, her voice too casual. "Oh, those are just myths, I'm afraid. No one has seen them in decades." Her smile returned, but it was strained, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the moment like a cat on a mouse. She recalled a St. Mary Mead incident, where a young woman had hidden a stolen brooch in her diary, claiming it was mere scribbles. Miss Duval's notebook, she thought, might hold a similar secret, perhaps tied to the painting or Charles himself. "How fascinating," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "I do love a good mystery, don't you? Though I suppose last night's tragedy is mystery enough." She watched Miss Duval's reaction, noting the way her fingers twitched, as if itching to open her purse. "Yes, a terrible mystery," Miss Duval agreed, her voice steady now. "I felt so ill. I had to leave. The excitement, you know. It was overwhelming." Her excuse for her departure was the same as she had given the inspector, but Miss Marple sensed a rehearsed quality to it, like a line from a play. She thought of the cyanide, its bitter almond scent, faint in the auction hall, and wondered if Miss Duval's illness had been a convenient escape from a scene she knew would turn deadly. They spoke a while longer, Miss Duval regaling her with tales of Parisian art galleries and Florence's hidden treasures. Her charm was undeniable, but Miss Marple saw through it, recognizing the artifice of a woman accustomed to guarding her true thoughts. As they parted, Miss Duval's handshake was firm, her smile polite but distant. "You are a delightful companion, Miss Marple," she said. "I hope we meet again." But her eyes held a wariness, as if she sensed the old lady's quiet scrutiny. Miss Marple stepped into the Bloomsbury street, the air sharp with the promise of evening. She pulled her shawl closer, her mind sifting through the encounter. Miss Duval was a puzzle, her knowledge of Morelli genuine, but her motives opaque. The notebook, the mention of sketches, her hasty exit from the auction, all were threads that did not yet connect. Miss Marple thought of Charles's obsession with the Midnight Rose, his claim of legacy, and wondered if Miss Duval knew more about it than she admitted. Had she been at the auction to bid, to observe, or to ensure someone else's failure? She recalled a village girl, Emily, who had played the innocent while orchestrating a rival's downfall over a petty slight. Miss Duval was no village lass, but the principle was the same. Those who hid their intentions often had the most to conceal. The sketches, Miss Marple thought, might be the key, a secret tied to the painting that Charles had perhaps uncovered. She made a mental note to inquire further, perhaps through Beatrice, who had contacts in the art world. As she hailed a cab to return to her hotel, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other players. Tate's cold ambition, Mrs. Crane's financial desperation, Murchison's nervous tics, all were pieces of the puzzle. But Miss Duval's enigma added a new layer. The cyanide had been a deliberate act, and Miss Marple wondered if Miss Duval's knowledge of Morelli extended to knowing who might kill for his work. For now, she would continue her quiet inquiries, trusting that the truth, like a shy creature, would emerge from the shadows in time. Chapter 7. The Auctioneer's Secret. The evening shadows lengthened over London as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to Murchison and Sons, the auction house now a silent sentinel of the previous night's tragedy. The mist had cleared, leaving a crisp clarity in the air, but the weight of Charles Haverford's death lingered like a fog in Miss Marple's mind. She had arranged to meet Mr. Reginald Murchison under the pretence of inquiring about a minor lot from the auction, a porcelain figurine she had no intention of purchasing. Her true aim was to probe the auctioneer's nervous demeanour, which had struck her as more than mere shock at the murder. In her St. Mary Mead days, she had known men like Murchison, polished on the surface, but with secrets that betrayed themselves in a twitch or a glance. The auction house was eerily quiet, its grand hall empty, save for a few staff members tidying the rows of chairs. The chandeliers were dimmed, casting long shadows across the mahogany-panelled walls, and the Midnight Rose had been removed from its easel, likely secured by the police. Miss Marple found Murchison in his office, a cluttered room at the back of the building, its shelves lined with auction catalogues and art books. He was hunched over a ledger, his sharp moustache drooping slightly, his face pale under the glow of a desk lamp. When he saw her, he started, his hand knocking a pen to the floor. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with an attempt at his usual polish. "This is unexpected. I'm afraid we're rather disarrayed after last night." His voice was strained, and Miss Marple noted the beads of sweat on his brow, despite the coolness of the room. She smiled, her expression one of gentle concern, and settled into a chair opposite his desk, her knitting bag at her side. "I quite understand, Mr. Murchison," she said, her voice soft as a village gossip's whisper. "Such a dreadful event. I only thought to ask about a small figurine from the auction, but I see you're terribly busy. It must be difficult managing such a scandal." Her words were sympathetic, but her eyes were keen, watching the way his fingers fumbled with the ledger, closing it with a haste that seemed unnecessary. Murchison forced a smile, his moustache twitching. "A scandal, indeed," he said. "My auction house has never seen such a thing. The police have been poking about all day, asking questions, upsetting my staff. I assure you, Miss Marple, the champagne was standard, served to all guests. I can't imagine how this happened." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the defensive edge, as if he were rehearsing a speech for the inspector. She nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she produced them from her bag. "Of course, you run a reputable business," she said, her tone soothing. "But it's curious, isn't it, how such a tragedy can strike so suddenly? Poor Mr. Haverford was so eager for the midnight rose. Did he ever speak to you about it?" She watched him closely, noting the way his eyes darted to the ledger before meeting hers. "Haverford was persistent," Murchison said, his voice tightening. "He came to me a week before the auction, asking about the painting's provenance. He wanted details, where it came from, who had owned it before Mrs. Crane. I told him what I knew, which wasn't much. It's a Morelli, after all. The history is part of its allure." He laughed a brittle sound, and Miss Marple sensed he was holding something back. She leaned forward slightly. Her knitting paused. "How interesting," she said. "He must have been quite determined to secure it. I suppose Mrs. Crane's decision to sell was a surprise then." Her question was innocent, but it was a probe, designed to test Murchison's reaction. His fingers tightened on the ledger, and for a moment she thought he might deflect. But he sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "It was rather last minute," he admitted, his voice low. "Mrs. Crane insisted on adding the Midnight Rose to the catalogue just 2 weeks ago. I advised against it. Such a piece needs proper promotion, but she was adamant. Said she needed the funds urgently." His eyes flickered to the door, as if expecting an interruption. And Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail. A last-minute addition suggested pressure, perhaps desperation, and she wondered if Murchison knew more about Mrs. Crane's motives than he let on. She shifted the conversation, her voice as mild as ever. "You must see so many treasures pass through your hands," she said, gesturing to the catalogues on his shelves. "It's a wonder you keep track of them all. I suppose you have records of every lot." She glanced at the ledger, her tone casual, but Murchison's reaction was telling. He slid the book closer to himself, his hand resting protectively on its cover. "Of course," he said too quickly. "Every lot is documented, provenance, bids, buyers. It's all quite routine." But his voice held a tremor, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper who had kept a secret ledger to hide his dealings with a smuggler. Murchison's ledger, she suspected, might hold a similar secret, perhaps tied to the painting or Charles's inquiries. "Did Mr. Haverford's questions trouble you?" she asked, her eyes fixed on his face. "He seemed so passionate, almost as if he knew something about the painting others didn't." Murchison's moustache twitched again, and he mopped his brow with his handkerchief, though the room was far from warm. "Trouble me? No, no," he said, his laugh forced. "He was just another bidder, eager to make a name for himself. Collectors can be obsessive, you know." But his eyes betrayed him, darting to the ledger once more, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper unease. Had Charles's probing threatened Murchison's carefully curated reputation, or was there something about the Midnight Rose that he wished to keep hidden? They spoke a while longer, Murchison growing increasingly flustered under her gentle questioning. He spoke of the auction house's history, his father's legacy, the pressures of maintaining prestige, but his words felt rehearsed, like a script meant to deflect. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the cyanide, its precise delivery suggesting someone with access to the champagne service. Murchison, as the auctioneer, controlled the event's flow, but would he risk his livelihood for murder? She recalled a village vicar who had tampered with a rival's hymnals out of spite, a petty act that had unravelled a larger scheme. Murchison's nervousness suggested he was hiding something, but whether it was murder or mere complicity, she could not yet say. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by a framed photograph on the wall. A younger Murchison standing proudly beside his father in front of the auction house. "A fine legacy," she said, her tone admiring. Murchison's face softened, but only briefly. "It's a heavy one," he replied, his voice low. "One does what one must to protect it." His words lingered in her mind as she stepped into the evening air, the street lamps casting a soft glow over the cobblestones. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirl of connections as she walked to her cab. Murchison's nervous tics, his guarded ledger, his admission of Mrs. Crane's last-minute addition, all pointed to a man under pressure. Had Charles's inquiries about the painting's provenance threatened to expose some irregularity? Or was Murchison merely a bystander, caught in the web of someone else's scheme? She thought of Tate's cold ambition, Mrs. Crane's financial desperation, and Miss Duval's cryptic notebook, each a thread in the tapestry of this murder. She recalled a St. Mary Mead auction, where a disputed antique had led to bitter rivalries, though none so deadly as this. Murchison's role, she suspected, was not that of the mastermind, but of a man who knew more than he dared admit. The ledger, she thought, might hold the key. A record of the painting's journey, perhaps, or a clue to why Charles had been so determined to claim it. She made a mental note to ask Beatrice if her contacts in the art world could shed light on Murchison's dealings. As she settled into the cab, Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to her racing thoughts. The truth was close, she felt, hidden in the small things. A ledger's page, a nervous glance, a last-minute decision. She would return to the auction house, perhaps under another pretext, to see what more she could uncover. For now, she leaned back, her eyes on the passing streets, and let the puzzle pieces settle, knowing that the heart of this deadly auction was within her reach. Chapter 8. A pattern emerges. The soft glow of a single lamp illuminated Miss Jane Marple's hotel room as evening settled over London. The city's hum was muted beyond the window, its streets cloaked in a twilight that mirrored the haze of the mystery before her. She sat at a small writing desk, her knitting set aside for the moment, her notes spread out like a patchwork quilt. Pages torn from a pocketbook bore her neat, spidery handwriting. Observations on Mr. Murchison's nervous tics, Mrs. Crane's veiled distress, Mr. Tate's calculated lie, and Miss Duval's cryptic notebook. Each was a thread in the tapestry of Charles Haverford's murder. And Miss Marple, with her village-honed instincts, was beginning to see a pattern emerge. She sipped a cup of chamomile tea, its warmth a comfort against the chill of the case. The facts were stark. Charles had collapsed after drinking champagne laced with cyanide, a poison that required intent and precision. The auction hall, with its flurry of bidders and staff, had provided ample opportunity, but motive was the key, and that remained elusive. Miss Marple's mind turned to the players, each with their own secrets. Mrs. Crane's financial desperation suggested a need to secure the sale of the Midnight Rose, but would she kill to ensure it? Mr. Tate's cold ambition pointed to a man who thrived on victory, his lie about not drinking a crack in his armour. Miss Duval's sudden departure and guarded notebook hinted at knowledge she wished to conceal, and Mr. Murchison, with his protective grip on the ledger, seemed to fear exposure of some hidden truth. Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes half closed, letting her thoughts drift to St. Mary Mead. She recalled a farmer, Mr. Hodges, who had poisoned a rival's livestock to secure a land deal, his motive rooted in greed but masked by neighbourly charm. The parallel was not exact, but it reminded her that murder often sprang from simple desires: wealth, power, revenge, cloaked in complexity. Charles's obsession with the Midnight Rose, his claim of legacy, had made him a target, but whose hand had wielded the poison? She turned to her notes, her finger tracing a line about Tate's demeanour at the café, his scorn for Charles's romantic nonsense. His ambition, she thought, was not just for the painting, but for the triumph of crushing a rival. She considered the cyanide itself, its bitter almond scent a fleeting clue in the chaos of the auction hall. The poison was not easily obtained, suggesting premeditation. The champagne flute, identical to dozens others, had been targeted with chilling accuracy, ruling out a random act. Miss Marple recalled the waiter Tom, his pale face and trembling hands as he hovered near Charles's table. Had he been an unwitting tool, or a knowing accomplice? She thought of Murchison's claim that the champagne was standard, served to all, yet only Charles had fallen. The bottle, now in police hands, might yield fingerprints, but Miss Marple's instincts told her the truth lay in the human, not the physical. Her thoughts returned to Tate. His lie about not drinking during auctions was a small but telling discrepancy, like a villager's claim of innocence undone by a guilty glance. At the café, his cold dismissal of Charles had carried a personal edge, as if their rivalry extended beyond the auction. Miss Marple wondered if Charles's pursuit of the Midnight Rose had threatened Tate's carefully curated reputation as a collector. She recalled his words, "I collect for the thrill of possession." That thrill, she suspected, could drive a man to desperate acts, especially if he saw Charles as an obstacle to his victory. Yet she could not dismiss the others. Mrs. Crane's financial straits, revealed in her trembling admission, suggested a woman on the edge. Had Charles's aggressive bidding, or his probing about the painting's provenance, threatened her salvation? Miss Duval's notebook and her reaction to the mention of Morelli's sketches hinted at a hidden agenda. Was she merely an observer? Or did she know something about the painting that made Charles a danger? And Murchison, with his nervous tics and guarded ledger, seemed to fear exposure. Was he complicit, or simply a man caught in the crossfire of another's scheme? Miss Marple's eyes fell on a note about Charles's visit to Mrs. Crane, his claim that the painting was his legacy. The word nagged at her, like a tune half remembered. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead spinster, Miss Elspeth, who had clung to a family heirloom as proof of her lineage, only to discover it was a fake. Had Charles believed the Midnight Rose held some personal significance, perhaps tied to Morelli's history? Or was his legacy a delusion, fueling a rivalry that ended in murder? She made a mental note to ask Lady Beatrice if Charles had ever spoken of Morelli beyond the auction, perhaps hinting at a connection to the artist or the painting's past. The telephone on the desk rang, startling her from her reverie. It was Beatrice, her voice tight with worry. "Jane, have you learned anything? The police are hounding poor Evelyn Crane, and Charles's friends are in an uproar. They say he was after something more than the painting, some secret about Morelli." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone calm. "How interesting, my dear. Did Charles ever mention what this secret might be?" Beatrice hesitated, then admitted she knew little, only that Charles had spent months researching Morelli's life, poring over old letters and auction records. The call ended, and Miss Marple returned to her notes, her mind buzzing. Charles's research suggested he had uncovered something, perhaps about the painting's provenance, or the rumoured sketches Miss Duval had dismissed. She thought of the auction hall, the chaos of Charles's collapse, and the players' reactions, Murchison's frozen shock, Mrs. Crane's trembling hands, Tate's impassive stare, Miss Duval's absence. Each response was a clue, but Tate's cold detachment stood out, like a shadow cast by a hidden light. His lie about the champagne, his scorn for Charles's obsession, his hunger for the painting, all pointed to a man who would stop at nothing to win. She recalled a village parallel, a baker who had sabotaged a rival's oven to secure a contract, his calm demeanour undone by a single boastful word. Tate's arrogance was his weakness, she thought, and she would use it to unravel his secrets. But first, she needed to confirm her suspicions about the champagne. The waiter, Tom, was a loose thread, his nervousness a sign he knew more than he had told the police. She would find a way to speak with him, perhaps through a discreet inquiry at the auction house. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and crossed to the window. The London skyline, dotted with lights, stretched before her, a city of secrets and ambitions. She thought of the midnight rose, its tragic beauty a magnet for greed and obsession. Charles's death was no accident, but a carefully woven act, its threads leading back to one of the players. Tate's ambition made him the most likely, but Miss Marple knew better than to settle on a single suspect too soon. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often hid in the overlooked, the small moments that others dismissed. She returned to her desk, picking up her knitting as her mind continued to work. The pattern was emerging, she felt, like a picture coming into focus. The cyanide, the champagne, the painting, the motives, all were pieces of a puzzle that would soon fit together. She would need to tread carefully, probing without alarming, watching without being seen. For now, she would rest, letting the threads settle in her mind, trusting that the truth, like a shy creature, would reveal itself in the quiet spaces between. Chapter 9. The Hidden Clue. The morning sun pierced the London fog, casting a pale light through the windows of Murchison and Sons, as Miss Jane Marple returned to the auction house. The grand hall, once vibrant with the clamour of bids, now stood silent, its rows of chairs neatly aligned but empty, a stark reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. The police had finished their initial sweep, though a constable lingered at the entrance, his notebook open, his expression one of bored vigilance. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and grey shawl, passed him with a polite nod, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. He barely glanced at her, dismissing her as a harmless old lady, and she smiled inwardly. Invisibility, she had long ago learned in St. Mary Mead, was her greatest ally. She had come under the pretext of inquiring about a lost glove, a plausible excuse, though her true purpose was to revisit the scene of Charles Haverford's death. Her mind, sharpened by years of village intrigues, had been turning over the events of the auction. The cyanide's bitter scent, the shattered champagne flute, the players' reactions. A memory nagged at her. A fleeting image of the young waiter, Tom, hovering near Charles's table, his face pale with nerves. She had seen such nervousness before, in a St. Mary Mead lad who had unwittingly carried a stolen watch for a cunning thief. Tom, she suspected, was a key to the puzzle, a loose thread that might unravel the truth. The hall was being tidied by a lone cleaner, who swept the floor with a rhythmic swish. Miss Marple approached the spot where Charles had collapsed, now marked only by a faint scuff on the polished wood. The easel that had held the Midnight Rose was gone, the painting secured by the police, but she could still picture its haunting beauty. The noble woman's sorrowful gaze, the crimson shawl like a wound against the midnight blue. She paused, her eyes scanning the area, searching for anything overlooked in the chaos. The police, she knew, were thorough with fingerprints and glass fragments, but they often missed the human clues, the small telling details that revealed a murderer's heart. She wandered toward the refreshment table, where the champagne had been served. The table was bare now, its linens removed, but Miss Marple's memory was vivid. She recalled the flurry of waiters, their trays laden with flutes, and Tom's anxious presence near Charles. Had he been instructed to deliver a specific glass, or was he merely caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? She thought of Mr. Tate's lie about not drinking, his cold ambition a stark contrast to Tom's nervous demeanour. The contrast intrigued her, like a village squabble, where a brash farmer's boasts hid a timid accomplice's fear. As she lingered, the cleaner paused, eyeing her curiously. "Lost something, ma'am?" he asked, his voice gruff but kind. Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle. "Oh, just a glove, I think, from the auction night. Silly of me to misplace it." The cleaner nodded, resuming his work, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "You must see so much working here," she said, as if making idle chat. "All those waiters bustling about. Such a busy night, wasn't it?" The cleaner grunted, but his expression softened, and she pressed on. "There was a young lad, Tom, I think, who seemed quite nervous. I do hope he's all right." The cleaner's broom slowed, and he glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Tom? Aye, he's a good lad, but he was proper shaken after what happened. Kept muttering about a mix-up with the glasses. Said he didn't mean no harm." His words were casual, but Miss Marple's heart quickened. A mix-up with the glasses. Here was a clue, small but vital, like a misplaced letter in a village scandal. "Did he say what sort of mix-up?" she asked, her voice as mild as a summer breeze. The cleaner shrugged, leaning on his broom. "Just that someone asked him to swap a glass. Thought it was a prank. Didn't say who, but he's been jumpy ever since, poor lad." He shook his head and returned to his sweeping, unaware of the spark he had ignited in Miss Marple's mind. A prank, she thought, was a convenient excuse for murder, and Tom's nervousness suggested he knew more than he had told the police. She thanked the cleaner and moved toward the back of the hall, her steps slow but purposeful. The image of Tom's pale face, his trembling hands returned to her, and she saw the pattern tightening. Someone had used him, she was certain, exploiting his youth and inexperience. Her thoughts turned to Tate, whose cold calculation made him the likeliest candidate. His lie about the champagne, his scorn for Charles, his hunger for the midnight rose, all pointed to a man who would orchestrate a murder with precision. Yet she could not rule out the others. Mrs. Crane's desperation, Miss Duval's cryptic notebook, Murchison's guarded ledger, each held a piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple slipped out of the hall and made her way to a nearby tea room, where she had learned Tom was employed part-time. The tea room was bustling with midday patrons, but she spotted him at once, his lanky frame and anxious eyes unmistakable as he cleared a table. She approached, her smile warm and disarming. "Tom, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle. "I was at the auction, and I couldn't help noticing how hard you worked. Such a dreadful night, wasn't it?" Tom flushed, his hands fumbling with a tray. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled, his eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't see nothing honest." His denial was too quick, and Miss Marple's heart sank. She had seen such fear before, in a St. Mary Mead boy caught in a poacher's scheme, his innocence twisted by another's cunning. "Oh, I'm sure you didn't mean any harm," she said, her tone soothing. "But I heard someone asked you to swap a glass, as a prank. It's easy to get caught up in such things, isn't it?" Tom's face paled further, and he glanced around as if fearing eavesdroppers. "It was just a bit of fun," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He said it'd make the gent flustered, nothing more. I didn't know." His words trailed off, and Miss Marple saw the guilt in his eyes, raw and unfeigned. "Who asked you, dear?" she asked, her voice as kind as a grandmother's. Tom hesitated, his hands trembling, then whispered a name. "Mr. Tate." The admission was a weight lifted, and he slumped, his eyes glistening. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind raced. Tate, she thought, had played his hand too boldly, using a naive boy to deliver death. She thanked Tom, pressing a shilling into his hand, and urged him to speak to the police. "You've done no wrong, my dear," she said, "but the truth must come out." As she left the tea room, Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirlwind. Tate's involvement was now clear, but the motive remained murky. Had he poisoned Charles to secure the midnight rose, or was there a deeper rivalry at keyword, at play? She recalled his cold demeanour, his lie about the champagne, and saw the pattern of a man who would stop at nothing to win. Yet she hesitated to close the case in her mind. Mrs. Crane's desperation, Miss Duval's secrets, Murchison's ledger, all warranted scrutiny. She hailed a cab to her hotel, her knitting bag heavy with purpose. The hidden clue, Tom's confession, had shifted the puzzle, but the picture was not yet complete. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead grocer, who had orchestrated a rival's downfall through an unwitting accomplice, his crime revealed by a single careless word. Tate's arrogance had led him to trust Tom's silence, but Miss Marple was not so easily fooled. She would confront Tate again, perhaps with Inspector Harroway's help, to test his reaction to the truth. As the cab rolled through London streets, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. The cyanide, the glass, the painting, the motives, she was close, she knew, to unravelling the deadly auction's secret. For now, she would plan her next move, her quiet determination a match for any murderer's cunning. Chapter 10. The Confession. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy drapes of Miss Jane Marple's hotel room, casting a soft glow over the modest desk where she sat, her notes neatly arranged. The city outside hummed with its usual bustle, but within, the air was charged with the quiet intensity of a puzzle nearing its resolution. Miss Marple's knitting lay untouched, her mind wholly absorbed in the threads of Charles Haverford's murder. The young waiter Tom's whispered confession, naming Mr. Lawrence Tate as the one who had instructed him to swap Charles's champagne glass, had tightened the pattern she had been weaving. Yet she knew a single thread could not complete the tapestry. She needed to test Tate's reaction to see if his polished arrogance would crack under pressure, and to ensure the truth was laid bare. Miss Marple had telephoned Inspector Harroway earlier, her voice mild but firm, suggesting he might find it useful to speak with Tom again. "Young men can be so easily led astray," she had said, her tone that of a concerned aunt. "He seemed quite troubled when I saw him at the tea-room." The inspector, though initially sceptical of her meddling, had agreed to follow up, and she trusted his thoroughness would bring Tom's story to light. Now she prepared to confront Tate herself, not with accusations, but with the gentle probing that had unravelled many a village secret. She had arranged to meet him at his gentleman's club in St. James's, a setting where his confidence might make him careless. The club was a bastion of masculine privilege, its oak-panelled walls adorned with hunting trophies and portraits of stern-faced aristocrats. Miss Marple, in her grey shawl and sensible hat, seemed an incongruous figure among the leather armchairs and cigar smoke, but the porter admitted her with a polite bow, no doubt accustomed to eccentric visitors. Tate awaited her in a private alcove, his sharp features softened by the firelight, though his grey eyes held their usual predatory glint. He rose as she approached, his smile a blend of amusement and condescension. "Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair, "you are persistent. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. More questions about poor Haverford?" She settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her side, and offered a disarming smile. "Oh, Mr. Tate, I'm just an old woman who likes to understand things. Such a dreadful business at the auction, and I couldn't help thinking of you. So determined to have the midnight rose." Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her eyes were steady, watching for the smallest flicker in his expression. Tate's smile tightened, and he leaned back, his fingers steepled before him. "Haverford's death was a tragedy," he said, his tone smooth as polished stone. "But I assure you, I had no part in it. I wanted the painting, yes, but murder! That's a bit dramatic, even for a collector like me." His laugh was light, but Miss Marple noted the slight clench of his jaw, a sign she had seen in St. Mary Mead, men caught in a lie. She thought of a local butcher who had denied tampering with a rival's scales, his bravado undone by a nervous tic. "You're quite right," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "Murder is such a drastic step. But I couldn't help wondering about the champagne. Poor Tom, the waiter, was so upset, you see. He said someone asked him to swap a glass, as a prank. Young lads can be so easily swayed, don't you think?" She paused, her knitting needles clicking softly as she produced them, a prop to soothe his guard. Tate's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she saw a flash of panic, quickly masked by his usual composure. "A prank?" he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I know nothing of that. Waiters are always getting things wrong, aren't they? Clumsy lot." But his fingers tightened on the arm of his chair, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She had struck a nerve, and she pressed gently, like a gardener testing the soil. "Oh, indeed," she said, her tone conversational. But Tom was quite specific. He said it was you, Mr. Tate, who asked him to swap the glass, Thought it would fluster Mr. Haverford, make him lose his nerve. Such a small thing, really. But it's curious, isn't it? How small things can lead to such terrible consequences. Her words hung in the air, and she watched Tate's face, noting the way his smile froze, his eyes darting to the fire as if seeking escape. "That's absurd," he said, his voice sharp now, though he tried to soften it with a laugh. "The boy's mistaken, or lying. I had no reason to harm Haverford. He was no threat to me. The painting was mine by rights." But his words were too quick, his composure fraying, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes, like a shadow passing over a clear pond. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead Farmer, who had denied poisoning a neighbour's well, his guilt betrayed by a trembling hand. Tate was more sophisticated, but no less human. Before she could press further, the door to the alcove opened, and Inspector Harroway entered, his broad figure filling the space. His weathered face was grim, and he carried a notebook, its pages marked with fresh ink. "Mr. Tate," he said, his voice gruff, "we need to talk. The waiter Tom has made a statement. Says you paid him to swap Haverford's glass. Told him it was a harmless prank. Care to explain?" His tone was heavy with suspicion, and Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needle still, her role now that of observer. Tate's face paled, but he recovered quickly, his smile returning like a mask. "This is nonsense, Inspector," he said. "The boy's confused, or someone's put him up to it. I'm a collector, not a murderer." But his voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the panic in his eyes, raw and unfeigned. Harroway stepped closer, his presence imposing. "We've traced the cyanide, Mr. Tate. Found a vial in a dustbin near your flat, wrapped in a handkerchief with your initials. Careless, for a man so careful." His words were a hammer, and Tate's composure shattered. "It wasn't meant to kill him," Tate burst out, his voice rising. "I only wanted him out of the way, flustered, unable to bid. The dose was supposed to be small, just enough to make him ill. I didn't know it would—" His words faltered, and he slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face. Miss Marple's heart sank, not from surprise, but from the familiar weight of human folly. She had seen it before. A village schemer who had misjudged a dose of rat poison, intending only to sicken a rival, only to face the gallows. Harroway's eyes narrowed, and he signalled to a constable waiting outside. "You'll come with us, Mr. Tate," he said, his voice cold. "We'll sort out intent at the station, but you've a lot to answer for." Tate rose, his movements jerky, his arrogance gone. As he was led away, he glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes filled with a mix of resentment and despair. She met his gaze with quiet sorrow, her expression that of a grandmother witnessing a child's downfall. The alcove was silent now, save for the crackle of the fire. Harroway turned to Miss Marple, his gruff demeanour softened by a grudging respect. "You've a sharp eye, ma'am," he said. "Tom wouldn't have talked without your nudge. How'd you know?" She smiled. Her knitting resumed. "Oh, Inspector, I just notice things. People are so careless with their secrets, aren't they?" He grunted, unconvinced but grateful, and left to oversee Tate's arrest. Miss Marple remained, her thoughts turning to the other players. Mrs. Crane's desperation, Miss Duval's notebook, Murchison's ledger, all were cleared by Tate's confession, yet she felt a lingering unease. Tate's intent to sicken, not kill, suggested a miscalculation, but the cyanide's strength hinted at a deeper knowledge of poisons. She wondered if someone else had supplied it, perhaps exploiting Tate's ambition. Miss Duval's reaction to the sketches nagged at her, a loose thread she could not yet place. She gathered her knitting and rose, her mind still weaving the tapestry. The case was all but solved, but Miss Marple knew truth was rarely tidy. She would speak to Beatrice, perhaps inquire about Morelli's sketches, to ensure no shadow remained. For now, she stepped into the club's foyer, the weight of Tate's confession a reminder of how ambition could turn deadly in the pursuit of a single rose. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The air in London carried a crisp edge, as Miss Jane Marple sat in Lady Beatrice Harrow's elegant drawing-room, the morning light filtering through lace curtains to cast delicate patterns on the polished floor. The room was a haven of refinement, with its rosewood furniture and porcelain ornaments, but the atmosphere was tinged with the sombre weight of recent events. A silver tray bore a teapot and delicate cups, and Beatrice, her silver hair neatly coiled, poured with a steadiness that belied her anxious expression. Miss Marple, in her familiar grey shawl, sat opposite, her knitting bag at her side, her calm demeanour a quiet anchor in the wake of Mr. Lawrence Tate's arrest. The news of Tate's confession had spread swiftly, whispered in drawing-rooms and printed in the morning papers with restrained sensationalism. Inspector Harroway's diligence, spurred by Miss Marple's gentle nudge toward the waiter Tom, had unravelled the plot. Tate had paid the young man to swap Charles Haverford's champagne glass, intending only to sicken him, but the cyanide's potency had turned a cruel prank into murder. The police had found the vial, wrapped in Tate's monogrammed handkerchief, discarded near his flat, a careless act for a man so meticulous. Miss Marple, however, felt a lingering unease, as if the puzzle's edges were not quite flush. "Jane, you've worked a miracle," Beatrice said, her voice warm but tremulous, as she handed Miss Marple a cup. "Charles's death was such a shock, and to think it was that dreadful Tate all along. But how did you know?" Her eyes, bright with gratitude, searched Miss Marple's face, seeking the secret of her friend's uncanny insight. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its warmth soothing against the chill of the case. "Oh, my dear, I simply watch people," she said, her tone mild as a village breeze. "They reveal themselves in small ways, a lie, a glance, a moment's hesitation. Mr. Tate was too proud, you see, and pride makes one careless." She paused, her knitting needles clicking softly as she produced them, a habit that steadied her thoughts. "But I confess I'm still troubled by a few loose ends." Beatrice leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Loose ends? But Tate confessed, didn't he? The police are certain he's the culprit." Her voice held a note of hope, as if eager to close the chapter on her nephew's death. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Indeed he did, and the evidence is clear. Yet I wonder about the cyanide. Such a precise poison, and stronger than he intended. And then there's Miss Duval, with her curious notebook and her talk of Morelli's sketches." Her words were soft, but they carried the weight of her village-honed instincts, which had unravelled many a tangled scheme. The auction house, Murchison and Sons, had reopened that morning, its grand hall once again filled with the murmur of bidders, though the shadow of the tragedy lingered. The Midnight Rose, at Mrs. Evelyn Crane's request, had been withdrawn from sale, a decision that had surprised the art world. Miss Marple had learned this from a brief note in the paper, and she wondered if Mrs. Crane's choice was driven by grief, guilt, or something deeper? The widow's financial desperation, revealed in their Belgravia meeting, suggested she needed the sale, yet now she clung to the painting. Was it sentiment or fear of what its sale might expose? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Miss Clara Duval, the enigmatic French art dealer whose sudden departure from the auction had caught her attention. The young woman had vanished from London. Her hotel room vacated the day after Tate's arrest, leaving no forwarding address. Her notebook, with its hurried scribbles and her reaction to the mention of Morelli's sketches, a fleeting panic in her hazel eyes, nagged at Miss Marple like a stitch dropped in a pattern. She recalled a St. Mary Mead girl, Lucy, who had fled the village after a theft, her hasty exit a sign of guilt. Miss Duval's disappearance felt similar, though its purpose remained unclear. "Did Charles ever mention anything about Morelli's sketches?" Miss Marple asked, her voice casual as she set her teacup down. Beatrice frowned, her fingers smoothing the edge of her napkin. Sketches? Not directly, but he was obsessed with Morelli's life. He spent hours at the British Library, reading old letters, chasing rumours of lost works. He said the Midnight Rose was his legacy, but I thought it was just his passion for art. Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw the pain of loss in her friend's eyes, a reminder of why she had taken up this case. She nodded, her mind weaving connections. Charles's research, his claim of legacy, and Miss Duval's interest in the sketches suggested a hidden thread. Perhaps a secret about the painting's provenance, or Morelli's work that had made Charles a threat. She thought of Mr. Murchison's guarded ledger, his nervousness when pressed about the painting's last-minute addition to the auction. Had Charles's inquiries uncovered something that endangered more than Tate's ambition? Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Beatrice to contact her art world connections, perhaps to trace any rumours of Morelli's sketches. The conversation turned to lighter matters. Beatrice's garden, the upcoming church bazaar, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained on the case. Tate's confession had tied up the murder, but the strength of the cyanide puzzled her. He had claimed he meant only to sicken Charles, yet the dose was lethal, suggesting either a miscalculation or another hand at work. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead poisoning, where a jealous wife had tampered with a rival's tonic, only to be betrayed by her supplier's greed. Could someone have provided Tate with the cyanide, knowing its potency? Miss Duval's knowledge of art and her elusive manner made her a candidate, though the evidence was thin. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple paused by a window, her eyes on the quiet street below. "People will kill for beauty," she said, almost to herself, "but it's rarely about the object itself. It's the desire it stirs, greed, envy, pride." Beatrice nodded, her expression one of awe. "You see what others miss, Jane. I don't know how you do it." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting bag in hand. "I just listen, my dear, and watch. The truth has a way of showing itself." She stepped into the street, the air sharp with the promise of autumn. The case was all but closed, yet Miss Marple felt the tug of unfinished business. Miss Duval's disappearance, the sketches, the painting's sudden withdrawal, all were threads that dangled, refusing to be knotted. She would write to Beatrice's contacts, perhaps visit the British Library herself to explore Morelli's history. For now, she hailed a cab, her mind alive with the quiet certainty that the truth, like a shy bird, would emerge if she watched patiently enough. Chapter 12. The quiet return. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the whirl of Miss Jane Marple's thoughts. She sat by the window, her grey shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting bag resting on the seat beside her. The London skyline had faded into the distance, replaced by rolling fields and hedgerows, their autumn hues a balm after the city's clamour. The deadly auction at Murchison & Sons, with its glittering chandeliers and dark secrets, seemed a world away, yet its echoes lingered in her mind, like a melody half-remembered. Mr. Lawrence Tate's arrest had brought the case to a close, his confession, wrung from panic and pride, laying bare his attempt to sabotage Charles Haverford with a misjudged dose of cyanide. The police, led by Inspector Harraway's dogged efficiency, had sealed the evidence. The vial in Tate's handkerchief, Tom's tearful testimony, the lethal precision of the poison. The papers had trumpeted the resolution, calling it a triumph of justice, and Lady Beatrice Harrow had wept with relief, her nephew's death avenged. Yet Miss Marple, as she watched the countryside glide past, felt a quiet unease, a sense that the tapestry of the crime was not quite complete. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers brushing the pocketbook where she had jotted her final notes. Mr. Reginald Murchison's nervous tics, Mrs. Evelyn Crane's withdrawn painting, Miss Clara Duval's sudden disappearance. All were threads that had not fully woven into Tate's guilt. The cyanide's potency, stronger than Tate claimed he intended, nagged at her, like a village rumour that refused to settle. She recalled a St. Mary Mead scandal, where a grocer's confession to theft had masked a larger smuggling ring. Tate's ambition had driven him to murder, but had someone else, perhaps Miss Duval, with her cryptic notebook, supplied the poison, knowing its strength? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the Midnight Rose, now locked away in Mrs. Crane's Belgravia townhouse. The widow's decision to keep the painting, despite her financial woes, puzzled her. Was it sentiment for her late husband's dream, or fear of what its sale might reveal? Charles's claim of legacy, his research into Morelli's life, suggested he had uncovered something, perhaps about the painting's provenance, or the rumoured sketches Miss Duval had dismissed so quickly. Miss Marple had written to Beatrice's art world contacts, asking discreetly about Morelli's lost works, but she expected no swift answers. The truth, she knew, often emerged slowly, like a flower in spring. As the train neared St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's mind drifted to Miss Duval. The French art dealer's vanishing act, her hotel room emptied the day after Tate's arrest, was a loose thread that tugged at her. She recalled a village girl, Sarah, who had fled after a theft, her absence a silent admission of guilt. Miss Duval's notebook, her reaction to the sketches, her hasty exit from the auction hall, all pointed to a secret she wished to keep buried. Had she known of Tate's plan, or was she chasing a prize of her own, perhaps tied to Morelli's legacy? Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Beatrice to trace Miss Duval's whereabouts, perhaps through her Parisian connections. The train slowed, and the familiar spire of St. Mary Mead's church came into view, a beacon of home. Miss Marple gathered her things, her knitting needles clicking softly as she tucked them away. The village, with its tidy cottages and gossip-filled lanes, awaited her, its small dramas a world apart from London's gilded halls. Yet human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere. Greed, envy, pride, all woven into the fabric of life. Tate's ambition had led to murder. But Miss Marple's village instincts told her that the story was not yet finished. She stepped onto the platform, the air sharp with the scent of damp leaves. Her cottage, with its rose garden and cosy parlour, beckoned, and she looked forward to tending her blooms, a task that always cleared her mind. As she walked the familiar path, she thought of the midnight rose, its tragic beauty a mirror to the case. Charles's death had been solved, but the painting's secrets, its provenance, its sketches, its hold on so many hearts, remained a mystery for another day. Miss Marple paused by her gate, her eyes on the roses, their petals fading with the season. "People are so careless with their desires," she murmured, her voice lost in the evening breeze. She would write to Beatrice, perhaps visit the British Library herself to chase Morelli's ghosts. For now, she was content to return to her quiet life, her knitting and her garden, trusting that the truth, like her roses, would bloom in its own time.